So virtual leadership lunch, we actually started a year and a half ago, before COVID, before everyone else in the world was on Zoom, because we just thought there's got to be a way that while we're sitting at our desks eating our salads, we can be learning from phenomenal women. And let's use this time, let's make it on Zoom so that we can talk and interact. So what I want to do is encourage, number one, all of you to please mute yourself. While we're having our panel conversation, I suggest using speaker view so that you can really focus. And then as you have questions, drop those questions into the chat. And when we begin our Q&A, I will call upon you to unmute yourself and ask your questions. But for now, we're going to get started. I want to start by introducing Pam Sherman. Pam, I am fortunate to call my friend, but she is also a former Woman to Watch. She is a member of JWI's Board of Trustees. She is, as she says, a recovering lawyer, but is in life a nationally syndicated columnist of the Suburban Outlaw. She is a leadership consultant who has been profiled in People magazine. She conducts programs and coaches leaders all over the world about leadership, communications, and how to present themselves with their mission with passion, and how to find their edge, explore, dream, grow, and excite. So at this point, Pam, I'm turning things over to you, and let's begin our conversation.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you for your leadership of JWI and creating incredible programming that keeps coming into my inbox, and I want to click yes to absolutely everything that is coming out of JWI, particularly during this exciting and momentous time in our world, and the work that you do to make a difference for women and girls to ensure that they can lead healthy lives through advocacy programming and programs like these, because we believe that when women rise as leaders, that's when they are able to care for themselves, their families, and their world in the best possible way. We are absolutely thrilled that we connected with our new friend and really an amazing champion for women in the world, Phyllis Reagan. She's the founder of At the Coach's Table, and she's a doctoral trained leadership coach who has coached thousands of leaders from nonprofits and organizations. And she has guided leadership transformations in organizations around the globe. She's been featured in numerous media outlets, including Forbes, ABC News, Fast Company. She's really recognized as a leader in leadership development and diversity, equity, and inclusion as the former global head of diversity and inclusion at Warner Brothers. She has a lot to offer in her perspective about what's happening in our cultural moment now. But she came to us through the discovery of one of the JWI staffers who said, we have to have this woman because she has so much to offer in women in leadership. And she came to us with this idea about imposter syndrome. And I immediately raised my hand and said, I would like to facilitate this discussion because I have my own inner imposter. And I'm often told by clients of mine who are struggling with confidence and imposter syndrome, who are at the height of their careers, oh, how could you possibly have that? And the answer is so many of us do. In fact, over 70% of the population, men and women. But Phyllis has a very great perspective. And I'd love for you, Phyllis, to start with the question of your why, a little bit more about you and what led you to this work, other than your incredible introduction and what we can find on paper. I want to dig a little deeper into you and how and why you are so passionate, and particularly about confidence, imposter syndrome, and women in leadership.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm so happy to be here and just to share this space and explore imposter syndrome. And the reason why it became important to me was I experienced it along my life at different points. I didn't know the name of it initially. So I did see it when I was younger in high school, and then I experienced it again in college. And then as I had more experience, I noticed it was coming again. So it wasn't really correlated to my competency level or my experience. And I became very curious about it and did my own exploration and started to understand exactly what it was and the features around it. But I didn't really understand what what was required to get past it or to move through it in some way. And that's really where I started to spend more time looking at the research, understanding what was happening. But then I kind of put it aside. And as I became a leadership coach, that is probably what I experienced the most in terms of what people want to focus on. Women in particular, but men as well. And it's always, women get to the name a lot faster. They say it's imposter syndrome. Okay. And men just say, I'm feeling a little underconfident, but it's really imposter syndrome.
It's so true. So let's define it. Because it was defined by two psychologists who said that they found it mostly in women. And I love how they retreated years later and said, no. It appears in all humans, and the unbelievable statistic of 70% of the population. So give me just the textbook definition as from your perspective.
Well, the textbook explanation is the inability to internalize your successes. And that you cannot internalize the facts around you, the evidence of your own successes, achievements, your talents. And that is always the question for you. So if you can't internalize it, you don't connect with it, and you're always questioning it. And that
so
gives
it's a
you
little
sense
bit different
fraud.
from confidence, right? Because, a slight lack of confidence might, be a tester, but this is driving it up a notch, right? To, in doing some of my research on it, it's related to anxiety disorder in some ways, but imposter syndrome just seems to, be about confidence, lack of confidence times 10.
Yes. And confidence is often about, I don't have the level of experience, competency, and as that grows, your confidence in yourself, your ability to actually achieve increases. But imposter syndrome is no matter how many achievements, no matter what you accomplish, you still question whether or not that belongs to you, that it somehow is about you. And you're always ready for it to be questioned, for it to be tested, and for people to believe that you're a fraud.
And what I find so fascinating is that it's typically people at the highest levels, the experts, the perfectionists, and the categories. And I loved in something that you wrote about who are the types of people who typically claim or suffer. And I will say there's a suffering in it too, I believe, from imposter syndrome. If you could talk a little bit about the types of people who have that, I think that's a great way to really dive deeper into it.
Well, definitely it's a private pain that is universal. Many of us experience it. The types, so first of all, I will just say it's across both genders. It's across all races, all nationalities. But you do find that high achievers have a tendency to have imposter syndrome. So you will see women and men that are senior leaders or really doing a lot of fantastic work, like Maya Angelou. She suffered from imposter syndrome. Jodie Foster speaks of how she suffers from imposter syndrome. So they've achieved at the highest level, and yet still they don't believe in their achievements, that they are somehow tied to the achievements.
Well, it's so fascinating, the idea that it's actually the people who reach the highest heights, the geniuses, the experts, yes, somebody's mentioning, and I agree, stage fright is part of that as well. Soloists and people who see themselves as super women and super men. I have found to a person in my coaching, I always get this head fake, what's going on in the coaching, what are they looking for? And invariably, it does come down to, I lack confidence in large groups, or, it just, and I always think to myself, why didn't I know that going in, right? That's so what do you think about, what is it about super achievers that, is it about a balance or just a lack of insight or self-awareness, or is it just true anxiety that it might all be taken away somehow?
I think it's a mix
or all of the above.
that. All of the above, and different for for each individual. So I have some people that are very clear. Yes, I have all these achievements, and no matter what I say, so they are to me my yeah, but clients. So no matter what information you give to them, no matter what evidence they have of their achievements, they follow it with a yeah, but I don't really deserve it, or somebody else really did more of the work, or so there's always an excuse. And then there's others, and it has to do with the feeling, a lack of belonging that they feel. And so they go into a room, and that happens for women a lot. They're in a space where there are not people that maybe look like them, and then they begin to question, like, do I belong here? Why am I here? Am I, really up to par of the way that others are? And then yet there's another group that comes in, and they sit there and they look around and they think, I'm alone in this experience. People may look like me, but they don't feel like me. So without a conversation about how universal this feeling is for humans, of this feeling of imposter syndrome, you do begin to feel like I'm unique. Other people couldn't possibly. Look at all the achievements. They cannot feel the way that I do.
It's interesting. So we are getting comments, and I appreciate that in the group chat. And we will be opening this up for further discussion, so that you can all participate. But I love that. It's the constant questioning and comparing. And that is a big aspect of imposter syndrome, is that it's not just you comparing yourself to yourself, it's comparing yourself to others. And I would say that's a huge issue, particularly in this world. And we have a lot of young people on the call of social media, where it's interesting. We were talking before the call about a great article in New York Magazine a few weeks ago about the Zoom culture and what it's doing to women. And our body positive imagery of ourselves from looking at ourselves on the camera, immediately getting onto the call and fixing our hair and making sure the lighting's right and doing all of that, instead of just releasing into this moment and figuring out that we are awesome just as we are. So can we talk a little bit about, specifically for women, how do you find this? Where does it show up? I think it shows up in this body positivity issues, and where else?
But definitely body positivity, and I think social media is so detrimental for women. That constant comparison of a fake life that you see on social media, and then somehow that's telling you something about yourself, right? So it's a terrible way of confirming what isn't true, but you latch onto it. And then also the Zoom calls. I love being on Zoom calls because I do experiment and look around when men get on versus when women get on. It's a very different experience.
Men are like going for their, let me go for my rough cut look, let's see how awful I can look, right?
And they're not checking themselves. They don't use it as a mirror. They don't look around at other women to compare how they look while they're on Zoom. So
absolutely.
It is just, it's a part of the women's experience, I believe, about always questioning what we look like, is in terms of, do we belong? And so social media confirms that, and certainly this Zoom world we're in confirms that as well.
Well, and I would be remiss not asking you, as the former head of diversity and inclusion at Warner Brothers, you said that it culturally goes across all lines, but do you think it shows up differently? I think I shared with you, I was the facilitator of a panel between very high-level executives, and there were, and I'm going to say, 3 Jewish women and 3 women of color and Asian Indian descent. And my mother always said, "Oh, Weinsteins can do anything, Pamela," and I didn't believe her. Whereas my counterpart, who's an incredible, Indian American Indian executive, said, "Well, my mother said I was beautiful and wonderful and smart," and I totally believed her. I thought, wow, it's like, where does that come from? So, do you think that there are cultural differences that lead to imposter syndrome?
I definitely do. And I think there's more research that's needed.
Yes.
I was just talking to my 15-year-old, and he was like, "Mom, that should be you researching that." Because
yes.
I was saying I really see a difference in the expression of it, perhaps, when I'm looking across at Black women versus Latino women versus Asian American women, Caucasian women, and Jewish women, and the expression of it is different. It would be interesting to know, though, internally, do they have the same thoughts, the same thinking traps, I call them, that they are struggling with, and they just express it differently? Or culturally, do they just have a different sense of self? And that's what I would like to see, what those differences are.
I encourage you to do that research, because I think imposter syndrome has become a big bucket, and I don't think there's enough research about it. I know that obviously the initial researchers, and I'm trying to remember their names.
Oh, Colleen Rose Clancy.
Yeah.
And Susanna Imes, I believe.
Yeah,
Susanna Imes.
and the other one. But what I love about it is that even they started to tread back from their findings. And then there was all this research about imposter syndrome is good for you. It pushes you. It helps. And there is that aspect of it. I think there are kinder, gentler ways to overcome it. And we're going to talk about your tools and skills for doing that. But I want to talk about the flip side of imposter syndrome, which is the overconfident. There was another great article that came out in Fast Company, particularly in the time of the pandemic, when we're dealing on these Zoom calls. How do we deal with the loud, overconfident member of the team when there are quiet people who have so much to offer? And our job as leaders of organizations and teams, and even those quiet people, are to find a way in through the noise from that overconfident person. I think that's the flip side of imposter syndrome, right?
I do. And overconfidence for me is always kind of a pause, because there's something else as well there. There's a lack of self-awareness. Maybe there's not a connection to the emotions that you need. You certainly aren't reading others very well if you take up a lot of time and space. But I believe that the responsibility for that change is with the leader. And so the leader has to set, some really clear guidelines with the team meetings, particularly on Zoom, about how often someone speaks, and passing the torch when it's someone else's turn. And it's having those direct conversations with your extrovert people, that's how they process and like to express themselves, but really letting them know that there are others that need a moment as well, and to give them the space and the voice. But I do believe that responsibility is for the leader to really establish that with their direct reports.
I absolutely believe that. And then also to check in with the quiet members of their team, and to have calls that might be helpful to them, maybe off Zoom, on a phone call. I am becoming the advocate of the good old fashioned phone call, Phyllis, because I think it takes away all of these trappings and challenges that really you have to know who your audience is and who your people are, and help them. So let's talk about our own imposter syndrome stories. You mentioned high school. Wow, that's a really early time to have noticed it. Was there a time in particular that you saw that? Was it related to an achievement?
Throughout high school, and I was an achiever. I was a high achiever. I was, the director, the head of everything you could think of. That was me, and yet I never connected to it. And it wasn't until later when I really understood the research around it. I was one Black child out of a class of 1,000 white students. Right. And so I never really had that sense of belonging and inclusion. And then so it was very deeply rooted into me questioning myself consistently. No matter how much I achieved, it was not confidence. I could stand in front of large numbers of people and present, and felt really clear, confident with what I was doing. But I somehow could not internalize my successes. And it was truly because I did not see anyone like me. And there's some cognitive dissonance that happens when you don't see yourself.
I was telling you, in doing research for this call, I started listening. I'm sure we are all listening to what's happening in politics today, but there was a great story on NPR, if you can Google it, about Kamala Harris and her time at Howard University. And one of her best friends talked about how it included imposter syndrome, and said by coming to a campus where we were all essentially the same, and we were all on the same mission, and we were all growing in the same way, we could check our imposter syndrome at the door. I love that quote. It's so funny because I just wrote that in an outlaw leadership blog that I was writing. Check it at the door. To me, I don't want to check it out the door. I got to greet it and say hello. So mine showed up actually much later in life. I barreled through, like not really thinking about it. And, you know, there was also a lot of work on anxiety and fear and overcoming things. But I have found my imposter syndrome comes during challenging times when I'm really going out of my comfort zone. You know, so mine actually showed up when I was asked to go fly to Morocco and work with a group of, you know, 50 corporate leaders and their spouses. And I thought, I literally kept saying, who am I? What do I have to offer to them? And then I realized that they wanted the essence of what I had to offer. And it wasn't about what I knew, but who I am. And so, you know, I think this might be a good time to shift to some of the tools that you use to overcome imposter syndrome. When I stopped worrying about what I do and what I know, I started thinking about who I want to be in the world, what's important to me, how I want to serve my audience. That's when my imposter syndrome, I could look at it and say, see ya, bye-bye. I mean, she comes back every once in a while, but
yes. and I believe there's a difference between like having sporadical, infrequent imposter thoughts versus living an imposter life. So that's an ongoing inability to detach from that. So
right.
I think
So talk to me about that.
It.
Yeah. So talk to me about the some of the tools, what you start with, and we can dive into that because I want to make sure that we leave a robust time for questions. And we have so much to talk about, you and I. So talk to me. So it's funny. I was thinking about, you know, the outlaw. I am so not an outlaw. My friends who know me know I really follow the rules. I'm a former lawyer. But that outlaw became sort of my, you know, Beyonce talks about her Sasha Fierce, what she has to do to overcome anxiety to get on the stage, that alter ego. Your tools that I've noticed have nothing to do with coming up with a new version of yourself, but instead really owning yourself and knowing yourself. So talk to me about some
and
of
I
that.
love that Beyonce does that, but for most of us, it's really hard to believe extreme versions of ourselves. And so it's about coming up with something that's believable to our brains, right?
Yes.
It's a lot of neuroscience around this. So we want to, but I approach helping people with imposter syndrome in 4 buckets. One, we start the work around mindfulness awareness practices because often we're not grounded in ourselves, right? There is some detachment to our emotions, to our sense of self, and we really are very future forward and past thinkers, human beings. And so to get grounded and to see your thoughts at a distance is powerful. So we start there and find a mindfulness, a daily practice that allows individuals to do that. And then the next is to do the work around what you were talking about, Pam. It's the values. Like, what are my guiding principles? Who am I? What's meaningful to me? And am I connecting to that right now? Because when we are connected to our values, no matter what our goals are in that moment, there is something about like the richness that it brings our lives, and there's less room for us to question about our version of what our lives are about and if they're important and meaningful.
Right.
The next bucket is to look at people's thoughts. So first, you know, you have a strong emotion, so it might be fear. That is always telling you, I had a thought preceding that emotion. So we spend a lot of time looking at, and we generally as humans have a very limited attention to our thoughts. We go right to the emotion, right? And that's the truth of the moment. I felt that way, so it must be true. So we go back to the thought and we look at what was that thought? And often as humans, we have thinking traps. So I spend time on looking at what are your thinking traps that show up for you? And when they do, let's come up with a way to challenge that thought and replace it with something productive. So that's the bucket of working with thoughts and emotions and linking those. And then the last bucket is acceptance and self-compassion. Because really, you may not be able to get over and overcome imposter syndrome. It might be something that you're challenged with. To have an acceptance that this is difficult and to demonstrate compassion as you would to your best friend who's having these thoughts really is about healing yourself and giving yourself the space to explore. Like sometimes I'm better at managing this and other times I'm not, and that's okay.
Right.
And that alone takes away the pain and suffering that we go through.
It's interesting. So all of these things are foundationally about knowing who you are, getting to know yourself. One of the things, you wrote a great article, and we'll be sending links to all of Phyllis's information and some other tools that she's going to provide after this call, along with the recording for everyone who's registered. You talked about, I love that being present, and mindfulness is a huge, that's been the gift for me during this pandemic, is finally doing Headspace instead of telling everyone to do it. But you talked about writing down your own strengths, but then I love that you like go out and confirm what you have to offer with others. Now, in a way, isn't that confirmation rising in your company, accolades that you might receive for, the work that you do? But you specifically say, go ask people, what do you think I have to offer? Talk about that a little bit, because that's a really interesting tool. I liked it a lot.
I believe that that's all the neuroscience of our brain.
Yeah.
We can see it and know it. Like, I just received a promotion. And so, but there's something about it, of course, there's some dissonance to that. But
Right.
when you go to ask Pam about, what do you see that I do well? What do you see as my strengths? Do you recognize my accomplishments? And you can give me specific evidence. It's very hard for me now to say, well, Pam's a liar, because I like Pam. Trust Pam. Pam's honest with everybody I know. And Pam's an achiever too. So now I'm having a harder time distancing myself from what she just told me. It's easy to distance our own thoughts. It's harder to distance it from people that we care about and that we believe in.
And I think it's important too that you find somebody that you trust deeply. There's a lot of empty compliments out in the world. Listen,
Yes.
We're living in the world of likes and hugs and you're great, awesome, amazing, right?
Right.
And so we've got to find almost an accountability partner in that front. One of the biggest things I have with clients is getting them to learn how to say thank you when they receive a compliment, instead of the self-deprecating. There is always this trope of the Jewish girl who's like, oh, no, not you. No, you look great, right? And I can't stand that stereotype. Instead, because I was that stereotype. And instead, when I learned to take in a compliment and it felt really uncomfortable, and just let it sit there and say thank you, that was a big tool for me. I think that's, as somebody is saying, for me, no outside evidence heals it. It's an inside job. Yes, absolutely. And I think all the buckets are a lot of the internal work, but going to find a trusted advisor that you can even do it in a duality. I did this with someone just recently where I said, I want to tell you what you offer me, and I want to hear what I offer you, because that really helps. And it was just a great exercise. And I was like, oh, wow.
I love it. And I do that with my clients when they get into that yeah, but. So I let them hear the compliment. So I'll tell them something that I know is a strength. And then they have to sit with it, and they have to sit with it for 1 minute without saying a yeah, but. And you can just see the rise in anxiety. Right? I don't want to take it
for
out.
me, it's the who am I question. Who am I to ... I love that we're getting this. Everybody's coming on in. It's so hard to not just reflexively return compliments. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, let it stand. That take in your moment. I always call them their spotlight moments, because I'm an actor, and my job was to learn how to be comfortable commanding a stage, center stage, and I imagine that I'm. It's really about raise. Imagine that I'm Judy Garland at the end of a really good concert, a good one when she was healthy, standing there with the arms raised. And I actually take in that moment. There was, the whole power pose concept, building that. And it was very much debunked in the research. But are there any quick tools in the moment? So when you feel it coming on, when you are, it's stopping you from writing, or from making that big presentation, or going in and asking for the raise that you want, the things that imposter syndrome keeps us from doing. I've been working with this great coach in Shirzad Shamin and his positive intelligence tools, where he actually stops and says, you've got to rub your fingers together and change yourself out, like a physical thing you have to do. Is there anything that you say where you can stop yourself in the moment?
And I believe it goes into the mindfulness. So in that moment, that's what he's doing. It's getting you rooted back into, grounded into your presence,
Yes.
into your body, because there is that dissociation that happens and you move outside of yourself, right? So you're not centered in your emotions and what's happening with you, even in your body. And so I tell people to take a quick mindfulness break. And a mindfulness break is really just 3 things that you're checking for. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What's going on in my body?
Great.
Just that disconnection for a moment and getting yourself centered in you is a really powerful way to distance yourself from that thought. Because we have thousands of thoughts and we chase after each one of them, you know, and they're just draining and they're not true, most of them. And then you're down that rabbit hole, and then you get into a cycle of like, I have an imposter thought, and then I have an imposter emotion, and then it confirms, then I have another imposter thought, then I have another, it's just this terrible cycle. So the breaking, that mindfulness awareness, is just allowing yourself to pull back from it and just distance yourself.
So just curious, you mentioned at the beginning, and we sort of touched on the pandemic. And, you know, I've seen all sorts of articles about how the pandemic is really seeing the rise of imposter syndrome. So what do you think is happening? Is it just that we have heightened anxiety, and so it's challenging to be able to take the time for these 4 buckets, as you said it, you know, taking time to think about our values, be thoughtful, self-compassion. Tell me a little about this time in the world.
I think it's a trigger, because imposter syndrome tends to show up when you are doing something new, something novel, or when there is a stress, it's new stressor in your environment. And that is COVID. So COVID is something that is, of course, a stressor, but it's also asking a lot from us to be new how we work, new working in a space with maybe children. Now you're also teaching them, you're in charge of, you're the entertainment director of your family. I mean, it's all new world about how do we navigate through all of this. And this is what's triggering people's imposter syndrome. And so it begins to be a question like, am I doing this well enough? Am I good enough? Am I still showing up for my, my role at work in the way that it makes me feel like people are seeing me as being valuable, or is this going to really show that I'm a fraud?
Well, and interesting, I think that that's exactly right. Many of the tests of success were, how did I feel walking into my office? How do I feel walking onto a stage, for me as a speaker? How, all the things that were my idea of success that overcame this imposter that I used were external trappings. So perhaps this is a time when we don't have any of that we can actually step back and do the work we need to do to finally check our imposter at the door. What do you think?
I agree with that. And so it's important to just know that imposter syndrome has triggers. So you have to know what are my triggers? So my triggers are when I am working at home and trying to multitask right now. So I recognize I have more of those, and I'm going to show myself some compassion because I know that that's where it's heightened for me. And I may not be able to change the circumstances right now, but I am going to give myself some grace to know that this is challenging for me. And I'm still going to I'm going to put one foot in front of the other. And what I find is that when we have imposter syndrome thoughts and feelings, we tend to want to do something big. Like people say, I want to overcome it. I want to move through it. Yes.
Muscle through it.
Through it. And I also say one baby step at a time. So whether you believe it or not, what's that one baby step that just keeps you moving through it? And you'll get to the other side, right?
It's interesting because I think there's also this pressure. We're in a pandemic. We're trying to change the world because of everything that finally people have woken up to, what we all knew to be true, that there was racial injustice beyond, there's just so many big things coming at us. It seems small to fix yourself, right? When we should be out there fixing the world. So let's just
Oh,
talk
I
about,
hear
yeah,
that a lot with
you
my
like that?
clients.
Uh-huh.
Yes. They feel so guilty that they're thinking about themselves and that they have problems. And they always say, I really shouldn't be complaining. The
There's the
world has so,
shouldn'ts, right?
yes. And
Yeah,
the, and,
yeah.
and syndrome has a lot of shoulds in it. So
Hmm.
that's another, but that's a thinking trap. And that's the work around like what shows up for me. And often it's shoulds.
Right. So how do we, in the end, it's interesting. Thank you, Karen. It's exactly right. Fixing ourselves. I mean, it was a provocative question, which I knew the answer to. But I'm glad you said it because I just think there's a lot of pressure on us all to pay attention to all that we're trying to do to change ourselves and change the world. But I actually think perhaps crushing imposter syndrome. But I like what you said. You may not ever be able to crush it. It's just about the tools to manage it, would you say?
I
So
say manage it.
we're going to shift to the questions in a moment. But so think about your questions and we'll call on you from the chat so that you can ask it yourself. We'll ask you to unmute yourself. So get ready with the questions that you want. But I want to talk about the vision of the future. Is imposter syndrome something that we can try and really, there's certain things I'd love to eradicate in the world, right? Like this is one of them, because I think about how it holds back so many. I've been able to muscle my way through, but I think it's about doing the work you have to do. What's on the horizon? Research that you think needs to be done. You talked about that from the cultural and racial perspective, but is there anything else on the forefront that we should be looking for as it relates to imposter syndrome?
Well, I certainly think there's more work to be done. So there's definitely research that needs to be accomplished around the cultural differences and even the gender differences and the expression of it based on culture and gender. But I also think neuroscience is a big part of this equation. So there is something I believe about this, about the way our brains begin to make their own neural pathways early in our life with our experiences. And really now we have this way of viewing the world that requires us maybe a different approach than what we know now, the work that we have people do now. I think that the future will be around neuroscience and that
you said something in in one of the 7 things we should be doing, which I didn't get to go through all of them, and we should send that article as well. Believe like a child. I love that, because when we're little, we think we are all powerful. We can do anything. In our dreams, we can fly. We can, I just got off the phone with my 2-year-old grandniece, and she's all powerful. She's everything she wants to be. I love that as a tool for, just pretend.
Just pretend. And I have plans to go talk to small children in their lives, like 3 and 4-year-olds, and ask them a simple question like, what do you want to be? What do you think you can be? And it's so amazing. Well, I'm going to be a doctor and a pilot. And they really believe it. And there's nothing you could say to dissuade them. And I think that that's just their possibility. And it's just to revisit that. And it's of course, it's innocence, but it's just this lens of like, it doesn't matter what you say, you cannot tell me something different about what I believe about myself. And that's what we lose.
I love that. As dreaming is a really important part of the work that I do, and having people develop a vision for themselves. When difficult things happen, but we know we have a guiding North Star of where we want to go, we get back on that path so easily. And right now we are living in that world of challenge. So finding joy, perspective, and dreams may be the most really powerful tool to overcoming our feelings of anxiety, lack of confidence, and changing our view of ourselves in the world so that we can change the world. So with that shift, I would love to open this up for questions to the rest of the group. Feel free to send this into the chat so that we can have a robust conversation and opening it up. Jan Maxwell, you asked a question. I would love for you to unmute yourself and share a little bit about, more detail with your question so that you can read it yourself. Jan, are you still on?
I am.
Hi, Jan.
I was just confused. Thank you for doing this. I was just confused because you were saying that with imposter syndrome, you are distancing yourself from perhaps the reality of who you are. But then when you're going to center yourself, you should distance yourself. And I wasn't sure what you were distancing yourself from at that point.
So that's a good question. So imposter syndrome is often distancing yourself from your emotions and the thoughts that really are grounded in the reality of who you are and the successes that you really deserve and that are about you. The distancing work that I do with my clients are around, like, when, for instance, meditating and allowing yourself to sit in a space where you don't follow all of your thoughts, because your thoughts are 1,000 a minute and most of them are not true. So just allowing yourself to be grounded in the present, maybe just really breathing and being inside of yourself for a moment and not following those thoughts. That's the distancing.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Oh,
I love that rabbit hole. There was another question, which is, how do we develop a thick skin? It's interesting because, you know, it is a really good point that the imposter syndrome is something that's happening internally, but it does show up externally through anxiety and how we behave. So that came from, I can't go up into the chat to see where that is, but I loved that question. Oh, is it Jan Carol Kaufman?
Yeah, it came from me.
Thank you.
I'm retired, so a lot of this is moot for me, but
not necessarily. You're still in the world, right?
yeah, I am. And I'm a retired rabbi. I've been a rabbi for 41 years. So I was a rabbi in the very early years of women in the rabbinate. And that's what everybody told me I had to do, was develop a thick skin. And I see from the people on the call that I have some of my students on the call. And I never developed a thick skin. And it took a lot out of me, I think, in my career. And, you know, and I'm just wondering what, you know, sort of what especially women can do to develop a thick skin, because there's always a fear that somebody's going to scream at us and somebody's going to yell at us and somebody's going to make fun of us. And especially people see it now with, I call him the Chacham in the White House, who's always, you know, just tearing people apart. And people are scared of him. And I think women are afraid, you know, women especially are just afraid of what's going to happen when we get yelled at.
I think that's an amazing, thank you so much, Jan. If you mute yourself, Phyllis will answer the question. Such a great question. You know, I'm an actor, so there's an old thing about actors. If you don't read reviews at all, because if you believe the good ones, you have to believe the bad ones too. And I never developed a thick skin. I get hate mail from the column that I write, which is completely benign, you know, and funny. And somehow somebody finds things and it makes me crazy. My children will tell you, if my daughter's still on the call, it crushes me and then I throw it away. Phyllis, how do we develop a thick skin, or should we not? Maybe we shouldn't. What's your thought about that?
I think that's very interesting. Thick skin, I'd have to go into that a little bit deeper, because it can be that's part of that grin and bear it mentality that you can develop. And that's not always helpful, because you're not taking care of yourself in those moments. But if it's about that I want to show up and there's a sense of anxiety because this environment is not necessarily the safe psychological space that I need it to be, then that's true. And I would say, you know, there is some measurement of reality check that you have to have. Like, the company I work for, they're not that supportive, perhaps someone could say. And so I am, you know, careful about my voice and how I express it. So there's real truth in that. But then to do the work, if you really do want to be a little bit less impacted by people's reviews of you or their feedback of you, I really encourage people to go in places that they feel safer and start to work on that. Like, how can I, when I'm working with this particular volunteer organization, express myself more during these meetings? So that's a safe space for you to start beginning and practicing. It may not translate to that particular work environment, but you'll start to develop a better way to sit with feedback or hear someone express something negatively and not incorporate it into your sense of self.
Well, it's interesting. So what we're talking about is being sensitive, right? And I think that's part of your self-compassion bucket. That when people say hurtful things, you need to go through the, wow, that hurt my feelings, and acknowledge that, name it, be okay with it, and then provide yourself with the self-compassion to say, but let's, separate myself out from their point of view. I'm okay, you're okay, figure out what's coming from them. I actually tend to empathize with the people who would take the time to say terrible things, I try and see their point of view. Maybe they were a little bit right, and then also to empathize with where are they coming from? What would lead to this kind of attack or challenge? Is it a symptom of imposter syndrome to be hypersensitive?
It can be, yes. And so you have to look at, is it truth? What's the pattern? And really start to peel that back. I do notice a shift though with COVID in particular, that there's a lot of discussion, if you'll notice it online, about leaders need a different trait now. They need to demonstrate empathy. And we know that that was not the case because it was based on the male model of leadership. So empathy was not a part of it. It was being direct and really, pushing things forward, very forward focus, forward movement. And now it's about, are you connecting? Are you checking in? What do you know what's motivating people, what their intentions are on your team? So it's truly about that being more empathic. And I'm hoping that will translate and stay with us, right?
Well, and it's interesting because they call that, the female leadership traits versus male. And, the answer is, again, men and women actually track each other in all the leadership competencies. And men just get more credit for it. It's interesting. So that was an article that I was quoted in the New York Times by Jessica Bennett, which I highly recommend, not just because I was quoted in it, but I'm very proud of that. But it was called Men Are Crying. It was Leaders Are Crying, Pass the Onion. Is it okay to cry? And she was looking at the gender differences between men and women as a result of COVID, and people are crying all over the place. And in the past, if we all remember Pat Schroeder, when she ran for president and she left the field, and it was literally a minute-long cry. And she found her and interviewed her. But she was pilloried for crying. And, for 12 years, I've been coaching leaders about being authentically emotionally intelligent. It's not just to be emotionally intelligent, but that includes empathy and authenticity and really connecting to your audience, because it's not about you. Empathy takes it outside of yourself. And I think I love that you use empathy and self-care and compassion as a tool to combat imposter syndrome. There's a question, Jennifer, I love your question on your thoughts on business coaching for entrepreneurs. I'm going to let, it's interesting. A lot of entrepreneurs feel imposter syndrome. I find that with the entrepreneurs that I work with, because they're coming up with an idea that's completely new or trying to take a new take on an old idea. And so they're constantly questioning themselves. They have to go in for pitches. Do you recommend business coaching? Or I would recommend coaching for that entrepreneur. Do you agree, Phyllis?
I do. I guess business coaching is going to give you more skills and focus on the business aspect, the actual technical part. But if you're experiencing imposter syndrome and as an entrepreneur, it's doing the work on yourself,
yes.
not the business.
I always tell people, if you're looking for strategy and understandings of P&L, do not be talking to me. But if you want to figure out how you can be the best leader for this company that you founded, that's the work that you and I get to do. And it's really, really powerfully transformational. Erica, I'm interested in your question. Erica McIntosh, if you can unmute yourself, because I love this. You're talking about getting through something, but imposter syndrome starts to rear its ugly head as you close out an important presentation. Such a fascinating concept, because I think I have seen that in some people where they can overcome it in the beginning, but it tends to, the tape keeps running in their head. Erica, can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so
thank you.
So my big question, I guess, is I can go into a meeting, I can present. At some point in that meeting or presentation, I become conscious of all eyes are on me. And then when I finish, there's this little bit of silence. And I mean, there's a million thoughts in that 1 second of silence. Leave me, how should I close this? And I feel the best way to describe it is feeling like I'm just sucked into a drain at the end of oh, I had all this momentum and then now, and do they see the lack of confidence in the end? So
wow, such a fascinating question. I have seen that, Erica, where people come out roaring, but you know, for me, for a lot of clients, I always say, you've got to visualize the end as well. You know, it's the murky middle is fine, but the beginnings and the endings are probably the thing that you want to think about the most for your audience, so that you can tie it up and hand it to them as a present. And nobody knows what's going on in your head, by the way. I think that's the best answer to that. So you probably don't, they're not going to know what's happening. But Phyllis, what's your take on this? It's a really interesting way of looking at it. I can overcome it in the beginning, but I'm going down a drain.
I love your idea about the take of like having the bow, right? Wrapping it up. What does that look like? And I also think that when we are in meetings and we prep for them, we're always around the what and the how. What am I delivering? How am I delivering? And we forget about spending some time on the who. So who will I be in the meeting? What will I express? What do I want them to hear from me? What's important for in terms of my voice? How do I want that to come across? And so we forget to focus on that who, and we'll have that moment. And there's a trigger happening, by the way, in that moment that starts those thoughts racing. And it could be, I've had this happen before, now it's happening again. So you get a pause and it triggers a remembrance of this happening before. So if you haven't really done the work and really grounded yourself into who am I in those meetings, then that can continue to show up for you.
You know, and the other thing, Erica, that I think is really helpful is focusing. I always have my clients stop and in mindfulness visualize their best audience. You know, that audience, you know, the audience leaping to their feet, you know, sort of imagining that, like, what would that feel like to have that audience staring up at you and smiling? And it's a visualization tool that can really help you with the endings. You may not remember it, but it's going to be something that grounds you before you go in, if it's a particularly important presentation that you have. But I do think it does happen, you know, because we're frankly all staying on these calls way too long, right? You know, even just an hour, we get sort of exhausted and sapped, and all the work that you might have done to build that confidence and overcome that, and you crushed it, starts to dissipate, you know, like I'm picturing, like, you know, the Avengers when they all sort of disappeared. Remember that moment? So how do we get them back in the world? You know, flip the switch. I love Michelle. Is it Michelle Manny? Am I saying that right? So talk to me a little bit about, I love this. I'm fine presenting to a group, but get very triggered in conversations with individuals. Fascinating way for imposter syndrome to show up. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I'm presenting like on a topic to even a small group, big group, doesn't matter. But when I'm having, like, let's say we're having in a meeting and I have to ask a question, from myself, my own concerns, there's something exposing about that, and something about all eyes being on you, but it just, you know, there's this crash and burn, and there's this internal kind of commentary of, oh my God, that's a stupid question. Oh my God, you know, nobody else is asking that, or everybody else asked that, and now you're asking it again. That's a stupid thing to do. So there's this internal sort of child that comes out in a panic, you know.
Right. No, I definitely feel it. I usually say, I'm going to ask a stupid question. I'm okay with it. But it's a judgment that I'm saying out loud. I'll say it first so you don't have to. Phyllis, there's got to be a better tool than that to help overcome that. Thank you so much, Michelle. What do you think, Phyllis?
I always like to think when it's individual, like when you're looking at something, to think of the person as being a mirror. So what are they reflecting back to you that you may be believing about yourself that you might be unaware of, that's now coming up for you? And also looking at the thinking traps. So are you mind reading? So do you think you know what the other person's thinking and that's what's tripping you up? Or are you hearing like should voices, like I should be saying something right now that sounds intelligent, like I'm the expert. And so really looking at what's happening in that moment for me. What are those thoughts I'm having? What's the emotion? And just really spending some time in that to see what that is.
I think also Michelle, did you have another comment? I saw your microphone go off.
I was just going to thank her.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I do think that what you're talking about, Phyllis, though, is that we have to actually spend time wrestling with this outside of those moments. You know, I even have clients preparing for meetings that aren't presentations, because I think it's really important for them to be, particularly now, we are coming onto these Zoom calls, we're not taking a breath, we're stepping in, we're not bringing our full energy to it because they're just constant and we're always doing it. So get up, walk around, sit down, jot down what are the 3 things that I would like to bring up about this topic so that you have something that can help ground you. But I think what you're talking about is stepping back and doing this work, because frankly, this is, if we don't do it now, we're never going to rid ourselves of it. So this is the last question we'll be able to field because we have about 2 more minutes. If you don't mind, DJ, I'm going to ask it for you. Imposter syndrome shows up when I consider applying for a job that I am wholly unqualified for, which taps into women in that they don't apply for jobs until they feel they're fully qualified versus men who will go for it anyway. So what's a way for DJ and everyone else on this call to overcome that? And that'll be the last question before I throw it back to Meredith for a thank you.
I love that because I think it's about knowing what type of imposter syndrome traits you have. Valerie Young has a book about imposter syndrome that's well read and really has a lot of attention around those types. And there are 5 types, and one is the expert. And so the expert feels like I am not qualified unless I am absolutely the expert on all aspects. And it prevents them from going for promotions or jobs because they believe like everything on that job description, I have to be 100% in order to be qualified. So it's first knowing like what is that, and then doing the work around, you know, what's the truth in that for me? Where did that show up? And what is that? So there's also the dialogue, the conversation to focus around inner critics. Like, what's that voice? When did it show up? Who does it really belong to? Because often it may not be our voice.
Yes.
And what am I believing about it that's really now in stopping my life, blocking me, impeding?
I think that changing the tape in your head is more important than changing any outside external critics that you think are lying in wait for you. And so as we shift out of this and I send it back to Meredith to close, I can say that this has been so helpful for me, Phyllis, to meet you, to have this time to discuss this with you, and to have these rich and powerful questions coming from the audience, because they now actually have buckets that they can look to, you know, the 4 buckets. We're going to be sending all sorts of materials. We'd love to keep in touch with you, Phyllis, through the world of JWI, because I think you have so much to offer our audience and growing our leadership and in helping us to grow in so many ways. So thank you so much for this. I'm going to hand it back to Meredith. I hope that you'll all come on to the other virtual leadership lunches, the wonderful programming that Meredith is leading, and then looking forward to our very exciting work that we're going to do in place of our live Women to Watch Summit. So would you, Meredith, are you on the call? You want to come back?
I am, Pam. I am. Thank you so much. I was actually distracted by Laura's question that I feel is an important one. And I wonder if people are willing to hang on just for a minute or 2 longer. Laura, this is Laura Diaz. Will you unmute yourself and ask your question? I think it's an important kind of systemic, bigger picture to get to if we have time.
Is Laura on the call still?
I don't know if she's on the
Well,
call.
I think you can all read the question, but I think what Laura is talking about is exactly right, that imposter syndrome doesn't just come from us individually, that it does come from systems that are in place that feed into it. Phyllis, you must have a point of view about this, given your leadership role in the past and what you do now.
Absolutely. And so that is even a bigger way to look at this, a different lens, is to really pull back and think about that imposter syndrome. If it's about a lack of equity, inclusion, diversity, that is something that requires dismantling in order to even, it's not just about that individual, right? It's about rooted in a system that's unfair, unequal. And once you start to take a look at that and put strategies in place that's more supportive, then of course you're going to go back and come in closer to a lens to see what's helpful for that individual in terms of the imposter syndrome strategies. But truly, when you see the inequality that exists, and I saw that in my role, and people coming into spaces where they don't feel included and belong, I mean, it really not only triggers imposter syndrome, but it can actually, you know, make it begin in somebody, right? They can have their first experiences from it when they're rooted in that kind of systemic racism.
Right. Racism, sexism, you know, I actually totally agree with you. I think that mine showed up when I was in a male-dominated legal environment in big ways. I think it's an important question, and one that honestly, I wish Laura had asked it earlier so we could address it, because I think that comes to your vision of what's on the horizon for dealing with imposter syndrome. Changing the cultural systems is an important part of this, as well as healing the world and healing ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
So Meredith, I hand it back to you.
Thank you both. I think this calls for a follow-up session on this, and it makes me think of what's happening now with Kamala's nomination and the reaction from other women with the "We've Got Her Back" campaign, to say that we're showing up for her. And I think we need to. I loved earlier, someone asked the question, but her image said to have compassion for yourself. Also, that we need to stand up for each other. We need to say, "You've got this," when we doubt ourselves and when we're listening too unfairly to that negative voice that tells us all the reasons why we can't. And when we need each other to reach out and be like, "You can," we've got to be there. And I thank you to Phyllis, to Pam, for your brilliant conversation and this inspiring. I think there are so many ways. And Phyllis, you said this, where women are uniquely made for this moment, not just for COVID, but all the things that we bring to our leadership that make us the leaders we need right now and into the future. And I thank you all for joining us. You will be getting a copy of the recording, of the links to the articles that both Pam and Phyllis were talking about. A link, thank you, Phyllis, to an ebook that she's written that will give us more information. And I hope to see you all again very soon at JWI. Thank you. Shabbat
Thank you, ladies.
Shalom. Wonderful weekend. Be healthy. Thank you. Stay safe.